shouting as you're going to get from me, I'm afraid. Very warm welcome to you all. My name's Charlie Beckett. I'm a professor at the London School of Economics, where I run a journalism think tank called Polis. And that perhaps explains why I'm very interested in this. Polis being obviously the root of political. I'm very interested in the relationship between journalism and news and democracy. Remember democracy? And today we're going to be talking about the relationship between populism and the media, and thinking about how journalism should respond to populism, and also thinking about the wider media context that these populist movements and parties operate within. We're not going to waste too much time trying to define populism. It's one of those things that we kind of know it when we see it. But I think it's important to remember that populism, as it manifests itself around the world, and I guess here we're particularly interested in Europe, is by its very nature both a mediated phenomenon and a very much an anti-media phenomenon. I think we should also remember that populism is rather popular at the moment. People do actually like it. A majority of my fellow citizens voted for what could be described as a populist agenda in a very democratic, one of the biggest democratic exercises that the United Kingdom's ever seen. I think we should also remember that there is some news media that is populist as well. This is not just a creation of the populist parties. And I think that we should be asking ourselves what, if you like, the non-populist media should do. And you know, my panelists will be able to talk about that further. But I think there are these kind of profound choices that those societies that are kind of waking up to populism anyway are facing as journalists. Do you carry on? Do you just keep going to work and doing your journalism? Do you attack the populists? Are you anti-populist? Do you think about those people who support those populists? Do you feel that you should be reaching out? And if so, how are you going to reach out to those people who support populists? And I think perhaps one of the hardest issues for journalists to think about is that of amplification. That the more that one pays attention to populism or populists, even in a critical way, perhaps you are doing precisely what they want. So should we not talk about populism? Well, we are going to talk about populism, and I'm very grateful that we've got, in order of speaking, we've got Jay Rosen from NYU, who has been talking about it earlier this week. We've got Caterina Froio from Sciences Po, and on my left we've got Alina Ostling, who is from the Global Citizenship Observatory. Going to be time, obviously, for questions from you lot at the end, so think of your questions, please. But I'm going to ask the three panelists to kick off with 5 minutes or so of their personal approach to this, and I'll kick off with Jay, please.
Thank you, Charlie. Charlie said in his introduction, populism is an anti-media phenomenon. And I want to pick up there because in the United States, we've been dealing with that fact for a while, since Donald Trump skipped onto the scene and ended up shocking everyone by winning the presidency. And his presidency, not just the movement that brought him to power, but his presidency is in many ways an anti-media phenomena, and one that I've tried to understand. On the very first day of the Trump administration, you may recall, some of you, that the press secretary, Sean Spicer, walked into the White House press room and proceeded to lecture the journalists there that they had distorted the crowd size at Trump's inauguration, that they had lied to the nation about how many people were there, that this was completely unacceptable and wouldn't be stood for, and that the Trump administration was going to fight back against these lying, scheming, cheating, crowd underestimating journalists. And in his ill-fitting suit, he finished his rant, basically his attack on the assembled press corps in front of him. And then in the briefing room, which after all is for briefings, it's for questions, it's for questions and answers, that's the whole purpose of that room, he then turned on his heel and walked out without taking a single question, and this was the very first press event of the Trump presidency. So I want to look a little bit closer at what was happening there, because I think it's a very complex event and very telling event. The next day, by the way, I wrote a blog post at my blog, which you can look up, called "Send the Interns," and the recommendation was that the major news organizations send interns to the White House briefing room instead of the reporters, and I'll try to explain how I got there. So if you look at what was going on in that performance, many things were happening at once. First, there was a message being sent to the people who work in this populist government, which is, you are going to have to represent untruths yourselves. You'll have to stand for them. You'll be part of an administration that just makes stuff up, and you'll be expected to go out there, as Sean Spicer did, and defend extremely untrue things that are extremely easy to prove false. That's what he was doing. And he was ridiculed for years after that for that act. But it was a message to other people working in the Trump administration that this is what you're in for. This is what is going to be expected of you. Then there was a message for journalists. And the message was, you are here in the briefing room as a hate object. That's why you're here. And we are going to frame you and treat you that way. Meanwhile, for Trump supporters, we have to remember, in many ways, Trump ran against the media. The message was, we'll put these people down for you. And in return, you'll have to lie to yourselves about it, because if you're a Trump supporter and you're cheering Sean Spicer on in this performance, you're also going to have to absorb this lie that his crowds were bigger than Obama's crowds, right? And as soon as you absorb that and you begin to say, yeah, it's unfair, the press completely distorted that event, and Trump's crowds were as big as Obama's crowds. As soon as you've done that, now you're kind of guilty yourself, and the Trump base is kind of involved in a web of lies that it's participating in, and in this sense, it operates very much like a mafia. Everybody in the mafia is guilty, so everybody has to sort of support the system, because if the thing collapses, then everybody's in danger of being arrested. And in many ways, not just the Trump administration, but the Trump phenomena operates like a crime family. So that was the message to Trump supporters, was, we'll put the press down for you, we'll put them in their place, and you, for us, will swallow almost anything we say. For the people who were opponents to the Trump administration, the message was, go ahead, criticize us, make fun of us, satirize us on Saturday Night Live, go crazy, criticize us, because it's exactly that kind of reaction that persuades Trump supporters that he's their guy. So, in other words, he's hated by the right people. And for the people who are neither Trump supporters nor determined critics, the message of these kinds of events is, don't bother paying attention. Everybody's just screaming at each other. You might as well just leave politics to the experts. And I think there's a very effective method there. So in that event, you can see how difficult it is to report on Trump and this phenomena, because there are different parts of the electorate that receive his performances in completely different ways. Here's something Steve Bannon, you know who he is, right? Said to the author Michael Lewis last year. He said, "The Democrats don't matter. The real opposition is the media, and the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit." The Democrats don't matter. The real opposition is the media, and the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit. And this is what I mean by populism in the U.S. in the Trump case is a media phenomena, because what Bannon is saying there is that projecting hatred of the media, putting the media down, turning the media into hate objects is basic to how the Trump government operates. It's not a kind of a charming feature. It's fundamental to Trump's politics. So to that kind of provocation, the real opposition is the media, Marty Baron, editor of the Washington Post, has a very interesting reply. So Marty Baron's remark about this is, we're not at war, we're at work. We're not at war, we're at work. And almost everybody in the American press thinks that is the first, last, and final word on this subject, because it sums up so well what they believe they have to do. Don't let Trump provoke you. Don't play his game. Remain calm. Our job is to get the news, not to be political. But Barron's remark does not address the problem that interests me. If you do your job as a journalist under conditions of Trump-style populism, then you are playing the role of hate object and participating in Trump's political style. If you don't want to be a hate object, then you simply cannot do your job. That's the problem. And detachment loses its meaning under those conditions, because that system incorporates journalists whether they like it or not. So I think our top journalists like Marty Baron are correct that if they become the political opposition to Trump, that's not good. They will lose if they do that. And yet they have to go to war against a political style in which power gets to write its own story. Because part of the reason that Trump is anti-media and is teaching his supporters to hate as much as he projects hate is so that when critical examination of the Trump presidency is published and broadcast by the media, it will be automatically disregarded.
Thank you, Jay. That's a very cheery start. We'll get back to the solutions apart from sending the interns later. Caterina.
Yeah. Let me try not to add an extra layer of cheeriness. And yeah, so I will start from what Charlie said when he opened this session, when he defined populism as an anti-media phenomenon, for all the reasons that Jay so clearly illustrated. But now let me be a bit provocative in front of you who are journalists. According to me, populism is not an anti-media phenomenon. It's actually a phenomenon, a political phenomenon that maintains with media a very complex relations. And it is because it has these complex relations with the media that journalists have great power to challenge or strengthen populists. This is what I will try to argue. But then in order to develop my thoughts, I think it's, and I'm sorry, Charles, important to understand what are we talking about when we talk about populism. Because here we are talking about, I mean, from what Jay was saying, we are talking about a specific form of political discourse that is Trumpism in this case. And more broadly, for having attended a panel this morning, we are talking about far-right populism, radical right populism. And then it is important also to understand that the core message of this political actors, personalities, leaders. It's not only anti-elitism or being anti-journalism or being, like putting the journalist in this big, empty concept of elites, but they have, let's say, a sort of stronger ideological message that, to my understanding, is nativism and ethnocentrism. They use a populist style to convey this strong ideological message. This is my definition, my working definition of populism. So I define populism as a thin-centered ideology, basically depicting politics as being divided in two broad antagonistic categories, the people and the elites. And for populists, journalists would fit among what they consider a cultural elite. But populism defined in this sense by itself, you see, it's pretty empty because it doesn't tell us much about who are the targets of the discourse of populists. Elites. But elites can be journalists, but populists also target some type of people that are not native, where nativeness is defined in many different ways. If you are Marine Le Pen, then you will define the belonging to the nation in terms of, like adherence to secularism or other so-called Republican values. If you are Donald Trump, you will define nativeness in other ways in terms of, like whiteness or, like adherence to the American model of life, whatever this means. So this is the first thing that it's important to understand, that populism has a special relationship with the media because it's not per se an ideology, but it's a way of communicating. It's a style of communication. And it is because it is a style of communication that has a specific, peculiar relationship with media and with journalists. And why it has this special relationship? Because, as Jay so clearly put it, it needs journalists to nourish its antagonistic worldview. It needs journalists as, like the strawman, the enemy against which orientate their political action. But at the same time, it also needs the media to spread their messages. And unfortunately, today, the messages that radical right populists spread are not so niche anymore. I mean, you are in Italy, and maybe this is a sort of outlier in comparative terms, but you are in a country where the leader of a radical right populist party is currently the Minister of Interior. It means that the ideas, these nativist or ethnocentrist ideas that he defends, are not so marginal anymore. They are part of the mainstream. And in this respect, populism is challenging for democracy because it radicalizes mainstream opinion on topics that are topics over which our societies, our representatives have to take a stance. And in this respect, journalists have a core and important role to play. And this is my third point, how to handle populism. For me, the question is not, of course, whether to cover or not populist. Some of these parties, most of these parties, radical right populist parties in Europe have been around for 40 years, and they are doing pretty well in elections, so it would be very silly to just pretend that they are not there and just, not granting them coverage. I think that what we should do instead is to try as an academic, as I am, but also as a citizen, to try to challenge their support. And if you look at existing literature on media coverage and the far right, what you see are two things. First of all, you shouldn't, if I was a journalist, I wouldn't ask two populist leaders to speak about their own issues. They are not there to speak only about immigration, crime, and insecurity. They are also there to speak about any other issue over which you, if you become the president of a country, you are supposed to take a position. And these can be issues that are less sexy than immigration, less mediagenic than immigration, such as, for example, housing taxes, or building a small road in the middle of, of a small village. So I would really like, and I think that it is important to challenge populists on other issues than the issues that they know. But then the second thing is asking to journalists, how do you cover issues that are associated with populist, radical right populist, crime, security, immigration, when you don't speak about populism? Because my fear is that, populism went mainstream. it radicalized the way in which mainstream media too sometimes tend to cover issues like migration. And I think that as journalists, you have a strong cultural responsibility to challenge populists on their grounds too. So on the one hand, avoiding questioning them only on their favorite topic, on the second, challenging them on the topics that they own. Because very often what they say is, to say the least, simplistic. And just to conclude, I will say why in few words, again, I think that populism is not really an anti-media phenomenon, but I think it's, you know, like it has a very difficult relationship with the media, is because, and this maybe it's a bit unpopular to say in a festival of journalism, but let me say it, is because, you know, like the populist style, and take it as a provocation, the populist style of communication is based on somehow simplification. So the idea of making issues accessible to everyone, basically simplifying the conceptual and thinking efforts that random, ordinary people should do in order to understand the major concerns that a country is facing. That's why, for example, the Brexit during the campaign was framed, yes, as, you know, like a matter of getting back our sovereignty in the UK, but also as an issue intrinsically related with immigration, was something, a phenomenon that everyday people could directly think to experience on their own life. So there is this, it is a complex relationship between the media and the far right, between the media and radical right populism, because they share somehow this idea. The media simplify information in order to inform the audience. Populists simplify information too in order to manipulate the audience. So, and since I think that journalists better than academics can speak a simple language, journalists can challenge populists if they don't give to them too much space on their own issues, and if they challenge them on other grounds than the grounds over which these politicians feel comfortable. I stop here.
Great. That's wonderful. Thank you very much. Alina.
Thank you.
Bravo.
I want to connect to what Caterina was saying about making media accessible. Coming back to the definition of populism, it doesn't have to be framed in a negative way. Populism also means appealing to a broad public, and maybe there is something to learn by the media and by journalists from how populists are communicating. For example, if we can also turn to the good examples in Sweden, a context that I know a little bit better than the US context, it has been, they have been quite successful recently in launching a satirical program on public service media, and it deals with politics and political news, but in a fun and pedagogic ways, explaining complex phenomenon and also making fun of them. And it has like 1 million viewers per week out of a 9 million, 10 million population, which is pretty good. I'm not saying that news reporters should be making jokes, but I think there are a lot of to learn from these new approaches. And also I think from the Swedish context, it's also very valuable to learn how to make news more accessible by making them in a simple language, something people can understand. So on many government websites and on media outlets, you can get news in simple Swedish that is accessible for people with a lower educational background or for immigrants, for example. What I wanted to say also that by previous panelists also mentioned this tension between elitistic and populistic, which I find very interesting, because in the US context, the media tended to be very elitistic, and I think this is populism is a response to that. So maybe the media should work more on how to engage with the audience, but at the same time the media is struggling with resources and closing down, for example, local outlets. And local media could be a venue where you can actually be closer to the people, to talk about issues in their community, and more relevant to the people. So maybe this is something journalists can work on, but it is a big question of resources. Which also brings me maybe to touch it up on a bigger context of sustainability of media, and should the public good dimension of media be taken care of by commercial media? Shouldn't we have more independent media that can cater for these needs? Commercial media, they have to make a profit, so they have to have clicks, so they have to maybe report on extreme views and follow the logic of the politics instead of having their own media logic. And this is also a very important aspect. Who is setting the agenda? Is it politics or is it the media? Again, in Sweden, it used to be the media who set the agenda, and they were pressuring politicians to respond. But now this logic has switched. So now it's politics setting the agenda for media. Yeah, I think these are the points that I find
That's
important.
really, really helpful. Just going to very quickly come back with a quick question to the three of you, separate ones. Just quick responses. Jay, this point Caterina made about elite. There was this sort of paroxysm after the Trump election of suddenly coastal media sending reporters to the flyover states. Yeah. Do you think that's a fundamental problem, and do you think that they've addressed it?
Good question. You're right. The first response to this problem of journalists being positioned as elites out of touch with the people who elected Donald Trump, living on the coasts rather than in the middle of the country, being white-collar, educated professionals, unable to understand working-class people. The first reaction of the press was to send reporters to these places and talk to them, you know, in bars and cafes and diners, and try and sort of capture the scene there. And they did this so often that it became almost like a joke, as if a few interviews in a cafe in western Pennsylvania could actually make up for that kind of a gap. What the only thing I could think of for them to do in that situation originates in a distinction that the great sociologist C. Wright Mills drew in the 1950s. He would distinguish between troubles on the one hand and issues on the other. Troubles were the things that concern people in their daily lives, the things they worried about, things they talked to each other about over dinner. Issues are what the political system is arguing about. And his point in making this distinction was when troubles become disconnected from issues, when issues don't represent people's troubles, you have a crisis of democracy. And the reason I mention this is something that the coastal media, the elite media, could have done that would have perhaps been more effective than interviewing Trump voters in bars in West Virginia. And that is to listen deeply enough so that you understand people's troubles and why they aren't being well represented by the issues. And that kind of response, which would have required undoing a lot of the routines in journalism, was never forthcoming.
Right. Caterina, I just wanted to pick up on with you that you talked about the complicity almost of journalism or the news industry and populists. Is the reality actually that the journalists are less important these days because of social media and the way that populists can exploit digital campaign techniques?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Charlie. That's really an excellent question. So, a bit of context. I'm going to base my answer on a research project that is ongoing in my university in collaboration with the Oxford Internet Institute in the UK. I hope it will be one of these projects that will survive the Brexit. Still, it's a research project that was interested in studying the extent to which social media allow the far right to diffuse transnationally some core ideas, right? And we started doing this because actually when you look at the literature on the far right and social media and on social media in general, you find that, you know, some scholars and some observers tend to ascribe to social media overpower. You know, like this idea that through social media, one politician could win elections, and unfortunately, we have some examples of this that happened. The case of Donald Trump and his Twitter use is, you know, like, unfortunately, very, very topical and recent. But actually, the cases like Donald Trump tend to be the exception more than the rule. And then we started to look at the way in which far-right organizations in Western Europe use Twitter to communicate their ideas and to find somehow some virtual alliances. And surprisingly enough, we collected more than 1 million tweets that were retweeted across far-right accounts in Western Europe. And what we found is that among all the retweets that these accounts produce, less than 2% are transnational, in the sense that they are originated in one country and that they are diffused and retweeted in another country. And the second finding was that actually social media seem to help the far-right and populist far-right to spread their ideas across countries only on a limited number of topics. And these two topics that we found relevant in this Twitter conversation between far-right leaders, organizations, and activists were immigration and nativist interpretation of the economy. So what they were discussing about, it was not mostly about whether the state should or not intervene in the economy in the classic left-right interpretation, but it was more whether, you know, the economy should be at the service of the native people of the country or not. So I would invite once more, and I would challenge you to try to think somehow to scale down some alarmistic tones when it comes to the relationship between the far right and social media, because it's true we have, you know, like people like politicians, populist politicians like Donald Trump, who capitalized a lot out of their media and social media activity. But at the end, I mean, this Donald Trump is more an exception than a rule, and social media may work as echo chambers for populist politicians, only, at least this is what my research shows, on specific issues that are already important for far-right audiences transnationally. Then the question is also to understand whether, and this is another provocation that I want to discuss with you, is whether social media work just for populists. I don't think so. All politicians could use social media. Then the question becomes, why populists are so good to use social media and not other politicians? I mean, if you look at studies on political parties in general, you find this big digital divide between populist parties and you know, like more established parties and other type of parties. Think about social democratic parties, center-left parties. They are disappearing in Europe. They could also use social media. Why don't they do it?
Mm. What about the wonderful AOC in New York?
Yes.
She's quite good.
She's quite good, yeah.
She's quite good, I'm told.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah. Alina, I just want to come back to you on, I love the thing you were saying about, you know, it could be positive as well as negative. Do you think that we're exaggerating the moment, perhaps in media, we're a journalism conference, of course we're focusing on journalism, but do you think we're exaggerating the moment, the uniqueness of it, the role of media, and do you think in a way this is a political phase, it's part of a political cycle, and in that sense it's not really the journalist's job to get rid of these populists. It's going to play itself out. It's up to the people, not to us.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Maybe we can launch the question to the public.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I don't have the answer from the historical
That's a very
perspective.
populist answer.
If it's yeah, exactly. I don't have the historical perspective to say if it's a cycle or not. But I was in a panel before lunch, and Damian Tambini was saying that this phase, particular phase, moment in time, resembles the after-war period, where there were a lot of crucial decisions to take about the media's role in politics and in society. So maybe it is a critical phase that we are facing right now. But how to solve it?
Yeah. I'd like to go to you if you've got any questions, or of course if you've got any wonderful solutions. That'd be very nice. There's somebody right at the very back.
Hello, my name is Lucy Roy. I work at The Economist. And despite being a journalist, I always get nervous when I ask questions in panels, so I wrote one down. Populist leaders, in my opinion, don't exist in a vacuum. So how can we report on their base and what sustains that base? And this, for me, is the kicker, in a way that makes the base not only feel heard, but met. And when I say met, I mean that in a psychotherapeutic sense. I mean held in compassion.
Right.
Just a small question.
Anyone who wants to make that?
Well, that's what I meant by distinguishing between troubles and issues. I think trying to really understand people's troubles and why they are not well represented by the issues is the way to go. But we have a long way to get there, because in, for example, election coverage, which is the most directly relevant to this subject, there are sort of two competing priorities. One in the U.S. system, at least. One is the horse race style of coverage, in which you try and figure out who's going to win and who's ahead and how they're going to win and what the tactics for winning are. And then the alternative to that is said to be issues coverage. But if the issues don't actually touch the lives of the people who are responding to populist politicians, then shifting more towards issues isn't going to help you any more than horse race journalism is going to help you. So I think that somehow our journalists have to understand people's troubles better than the politicians who are making and packaging issues from them. And if they can understand people's troubles better than the politicians who are promoting issues, then they have a chance to earn more authority with those people. But that's going to require basically a reconstruction of political journalism, and we're not there yet. We're still at the point of trying to get them to stop focusing on the horse race so much.
Go on. Take the microphone.
Yeah, sorry. Because I think that I live in the States, and I think a big problem there in particular is that people consume their media in silos. So breaking down those silos is also kind of a challenge that we're facing. I don't know if you can talk to that.
It is. I don't have a solution to that, but I tend to see the siloization of information diet as a symptom of this problem. It's what resulted from this earlier, deeper failure.
Yeah, if I can answer that as well, I can, because I'm the chair. I'm not so sure. There's a sort of, I don't know if this is what you mean, but I agree with Jay that whatever you want to say, polarization, silos, filtered bubbles, in a way they're a kind of symptom of, I think, the politics, the reality of the politics. They're not created by media. But I also wonder whether it's possible or even desirable for the media to go around trying to get people to, to prick their filter bubble, or to tell them, look, I know you're right wing, you should be more left wing. Here's some left wing information that I'm going to try and convert you from. I wonder if there's something else though, which is more about trying to, and again, this sort of echoes Jay's point about the horse race versus general political coverage, whether we're not very good at understanding, if you like, the emotional basis of populism. We tend to think, well, are they unemployed? Are they old? Are they living in, you know, the Rust Belt? Is that the cause of it? And we're not really interested in that. This goes to your point about it can be a positive. These people are populist because they like to be. It's part of an identity, and it's their values. It's not necessarily something they've worked out will bring them economic or other benefits. And I wonder whether, you know, as journalists, we're quite, you know, we're not very good at paying attention to that kind of emotional resonance when we think of politics.
Mm-hmm. And just if I may, a small follow-up on what Charlie and Jay were saying, I really like this distinction between issues and troubles, and I think this is really a core point. And if I may add something on top of that, I would say that I believe it is also important that journalists give the word to the targets of populists. Because very often journalists give space and room to people who are unhappy and unsatisfied with the way in which democracy works. And this is great, but you shouldn't stop to that. When they speak about migration, why don't giving more room and more coverage in the media to migrant people to defend their positions? For example, I mean, in Italy in the last weeks, for those of you who are following the news, there have been some major riots in periphery in Rome against the settlement of some Roma people. What is strange for me as an academic and as a citizen to see is that we are listening to journalists reporting 24 hours in a row on this fact. I still didn't get the chance to listen to one Roma person explaining herself. I heard, you know, the people who were there complaining about the Roma camps. That is not so different from what also the Italian government is saying. I heard people who were saying why Roma people were a trouble for their everyday life. I heard people that made of this an issue for coverage. I still didn't hear the word of the Roma per se, why these people were brought there. And if you dig out and if you give coverage also to them, then you could perhaps, you know, like help people thinking in a more complex way about, you know, like issues that are particularly sensational and dramatizable, I would say.
Do you want to come on? No. Okay, let's take another question. Gentleman there. Sorry, who else had a hand up? You and...
You've been, it's for Mr. Rosen. You've been talking about all this from a journalistic point of view, which seems right in a festival like this. But there's another side. As I understand, the New York Times is doing better than ever. So from a business point of view, there's not really a reason to solve this quarrel with a colorful president. Do you think this will be an issue?
That's true. The rise of Donald Trump has also meant a rise in subscribers, not only at the New York Times, but at the Washington Post, in television ratings like for CNN, and even for National Public Radio. And so, yes, it's without question that Trump has been good for the business of the media. And if that is all there was to it, then we could go home, because it's clear that just covering Trump and all the controversy he creates and the rage and glee that he provokes in people would be the answer. But organizations like the New York Times are complex organizations where they have business imperatives, they have to stay in business. But, for example, prestige is not necessarily won within the newsroom or within the profession of journalism by doing things that make a lot of money, even though those organizations have to make money. And so I think there is a professional ethic in charge in the New York Times newsroom. There's a verification ethic that's very strong. There's a huge drive to keep the Times sort of pure and at the top of the food chain in journalism. People who join the New York Times feel a debt to the institution and its integrity. And so all those things complicate the fact that they also have to to make money. So if we're going to try and improve the press at all, we have to appeal to the public service traditions of journalism. And those are alive, but they're in tension sometimes with commercial values, and they're also in tension with political power that seeks to incorporate the press into the way that figures like Donald Trump do politics. So yeah, Trump has been great for ratings and for business. That's true. And a lot of what happens because of that, but that's not the only thing going on.
Exactly. A bit like Brexit, really. It's been great for business, but my God. This, at the very back, not the very back, but really the very back.
Hi, I'm a journalist from India, and we see something very similar, in my country. My question is, when the digital revolution started in newsrooms, a lot of resources were pushed toward this digitalization and into technologies, and reporters actually started finding it very difficult to get travel funds approved from their newsroom. So do you think the resource allocation is a problem because of which reporters are not able to go, into the field, and newsrooms have started depending a lot on aggregation models, churning out stories every hour, causing a disconnect between press and the people?
Yeah, I don't know who wants to come back on that. Perhaps you could sort of slightly broaden it out to the whole disconnect between, and you mentioned that the media is seen as an elite, but there's kind of a disconnect that they're seen as not reflecting wider society, they're not getting out to wider society, they're talking in a different language. Is that something that resonates? No? Somebody else?
Yeah.
Well, it is important that this crisis, which I do think is a crisis for the press, emerged at the same time as an economic crisis in the press. And you can't think about one without thinking about the other. Part of it might be not enough resources to go actually investigate the conditions that gave rise to Donald Trump. That might be part of it, or to other right-wing populist movements in Europe. That might be part of it. Another part of it is, with the decline and decay of local journalism in the United States, people are kind of set loose to be attracted by demagogues and extreme populists. In this sense, it's in local journalism that people originally create a relationship with journalists where they see why we need those people and come to depend on them. When the quality of local journalism declines, that original relationship is no longer there, and they are up for grabs, as it were. And what happened to the United States in 2016 is partly a result of that.
Caterina?
Yep. I mean, maybe I'm too optimistic in this respect, but I really don't, it's hard for me to understand how exactly the press should be disconnected from the people. I mean, of course, or the media. Of course, it depends how we define the media. If we think to mainstream media like the New York Times, The Guardian, and with very progressive-oriented readers in general, I could somehow understand your argument, but actually what is surprising to me is that more people find in other type of media, like tabloids, their source of inspiration. So my question would be to say, and my point would be to say, okay, so in what media do people look for information, and what media do the people trust? And maybe we should try to learn somehow how to communicate in more simple ways as journalists. Communicate in simple ways on simple issues that are close to people, local issues. And on this, I completely agree with what Jay was saying. So basically, the idea is that if the Sun can have good shares of readers by diffusing news that are at the end, really problematic from many points of view. Why? I mean, a journalist who works for a quality media like the New York Times or The Guardian or La Repubblica in Italy, why this journalist can't borrow, at least a style, a simplified style of communication, and an attention to specific local issues that may talk more to the people. But I'm saying this as an academic, not as a journalist. So probably there are way more difficulties than the one that you face in your everyday work than what I'm saying now. But I would say let's try to get from populist media as well what can be useful to defeat and challenge populists, not just downplay them as something too bad to be taken into consideration. Let's challenge them.
Did you ever hear the writer complain, if I had more time, I would have written less? Did you ever hear that? There's an insight in that, which is when you don't have a lot of time to produce your account, when you can't think it through completely, your work expands and actually becomes harder to read.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So perhaps that 2,000-word feature in the New York Times is not going to bring down Trump.
Probably not.
No,
exactly.
Probably not.
Let's do a very, very lightning last question. Quickly. Because we're really running out of time, so quick question.
Right. Mario Teleschini, I'm an ancient digital journalist.
Yeah.
Coming up what Caterina was saying, I think that perhaps, at least in this country, but probably in other parts of Europe, the mainstream newspapers have had some responsibility in oversimplifying and shouting out some kind of populist message, whatever their political alignments. So I don't really very much agree with your last thing that perhaps we should go there. We are already there since perhaps a few decades, aren't we? And in other countries, perhaps there's a divide between different kind of press.
That wasn't a question.
Oh, I was
Doesn't have to be
pushing back on
yeah, okay, you push back.
It's a great
Quick last word to the three panelists, Jay, then Caterina, then Alina. Just last point, best thing you got out of this session.
Well, I really love Caterina's formula. The press should simplify to inform, and what populists do is simplify to manipulate. I think there's a ton of truth in that, and that is a huge challenge to simplify and inform. It reminds me of something that Tina Brown's husband, what's his name?
Harold Evans.
Harold Evans said, the challenge is not to stay in business, it's to stay in journalism.
Yeah,
That's
very good.
This is a very important insight. If you need to stay in business, you're going to simplify to manipulate. If you're trying to stay in journalism, you're going to simplify to inform.
Mm-hmm.
Caterina, quick sentence.
And I go back on my previous point on the question of a style. Simplifying style doesn't mean that we have to simplify reality. It's just that we have to make reality more accessible to everyday people. And the media, you were talking about the Italian case. The media in Italy, the mainstream media, they were very good in simplifying political messages, but they have been very good also in exalting some political figures that at the end disappeared after a few years. I think about Mario Monti. When he was appointed as Prime Minister of Italy on heading a technocratic government after the Great Recession, he was, portrayed in mainstream media as the rescuer of Italy bad problems. And he was doing the first pages of La Repubblica on a daily basis. At the end, he just disappeared because Repubblica was pushing forward the image of a politician that was just too far from its audiences. And then at the next election, he got less than 3%.
Okay, last word to you.
Maybe I want to quote a Swedish comedian, and he was saying that before, let's say 20 years, we had 2 channels in Sweden, and the news were very boring. It was one man reading from a paper, basically, but you knew it was true. But now news are very exciting. Look at Trump, but we don't know what is true. And this is the real challenge, to make news both appealing and fact-based.
And it is a challenge, and I hope you accept it. I think that was a fantastic session full of insight from my 3 colleagues here. Thank you all very much for your questions and being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlie.
Excellent.